Hello, this is Andrew Powell, and this is another devlog video. So I believe I said it's going to be every Sunday, but this is going to be the one exception. Today is Memorial Day, so have the whole day to kind of do a bit more work before I go ahead and post. Unfortunately, itch.io is down, so usually when I try to make these devlog videos, I like to start from the itch.io page and then start the game up. But now I'm just going to start up from my computer. I think my first vlog video, I was actually recording directly from the desktop version of the game. But these next few videos, I'm just gonna focus on the browser version, partly because to demonstrate that the browser version works. And one of the big things that I'm going for is making sure the game runs well on desktop as well as browser. Obviously, browser is the more challenging part um, for more reasons than just performance. So I think for now I'm just going to stick to the browser, and I have it's a way to also show that hey, if you go to my itch.io, you can play the experimental demo yourself, and I appreciate any feedback. I took a whole bunch of notes there for stuff that I plan to talk about. One thing that I don't think I've really spoke about at all in any of these devlogs is really what the main gameplay loop of Slayer Knight is supposed to be. um, I do more or less describe this gameplay loop on the main Slayer Knight page where the demo currently exists. For the most part, from a bird's eye view, the main gameplay loop is going to be pretty much the same. So there's going to be 3 levels, an optional 4th level that you have to unlock. Where the idea is that in each level is divided up into what I call encounters, and in each encounter, it's just a section of the level where there's a bunch of enemies that you have to kill. Well, you don't necessarily have to kill, but the idea is that you want to get the keys that allow you to open up doors so you can progress to the next encounter, which is just an area in each level, right? And it's up to the player to figure out the most optimal strategy of killing their enemies or getting past enemies in order to get the keys to open the door. The big goal of every level is to get to the end as quickly as you can, but the idea is that you can't just run through the level, right? You have to figure out the most efficient ways to defeat your foes and find the keys to get through the doors and eventually face off against the boss at the end of each level. Each time you die, you respawn at an earlier point. There's checkpoints throughout the level. You don't see them, but they're placed in like fair places, right? Like you don't get taken back to the beginning of the level. It usually places you at the beginning of each counter. But as punishment, if you die, all the enemies that you killed do respawn, and then there's a 30-second penalty. So there's a timer that appears, I believe, in the upper right corner. Is that the upper right or upper left? I forgot which side. That might change during this remake of the game. But the idea is that you want to minimize that value. Once you reach the end of the level, you're judged, you're ranked based on like how fast you were able to get to the level, and the highest rank is Slayer Knight, right? There's Slayer Knight. I think the next one is Slayer. The one afterward is just Knight. I think it begins with Squire. The different thresholds you have to hit changes depending on the level. Um, but the goal is to become Slayer Knight for every level, and then if you reach Slayer Knight on every level, you unlock the fourth boss. That's like the from the bird's eye view, the main gameplay loop. Of course, as you progress through each encounter, that's where there's details there, details that are going to change a little bit between this new version of the game versus the last. I briefly touched upon this, but main reason why I'm doing this remake is that felt as though the game wasn't as fast paced as I wanted it to. At the very least, I wanted a degree of freedom to be felt by the player character, as opposed to being very kind of locked in and you have to kind of wait out things. I wanted more fluidity. I don't think I'm pronouncing the word correctly, but the idea is that more kind of like freedom to the player as opposed to the game being more how do you say, very slow paced and meticulous. There is going to be a degree of you need to be careful, you need to dodge abilities, but things like movement, getting around, I want it to be very interactive and fun and not challenging. Obviously, when you face the enemies, you need to watch out for their attacks and dodge, right? But for the most part, um, that should still feel very fluid, and the character should be very much encouraged to always be on the go, going in and attacking, dashing through things. But yeah, that's just like a overview of like the overall main gameplay loop that the game is, what I'm trying to achieve. So while you're doing it, one of the main things I've been working on is just like the platforming. I want that to be very one kind of easy to do. Of course, the platform is gonna scale up as the game progresses. Like right now, there's really nothing much going on, but there should be a feeling of being able to kind of get anywhere. All right, so let me go down my list of stuff. So, obviously the main things that are different from this video and the last video is, well, how the character flashes when they dash, and when I hit the goblin, it flashes. So the existence of this goblin is the indicator that I've started the beginnings of my NPC behavior system, and then a goblin is just like a derivative of that. So I don't really have any diagrams, so you have to kind of like visualize this, using your head, right? But one of the systems that I have in place is what I call the behavior system. Um, and each behavior like component has a property that's called behavior base, um, which is a class that follows like a hierarchy tree. At its root, there's like the behavior base, which doesn't do anything. Then from there, you have the character base, and then from the character base, you have either the knight or NPCs. NPCs are basically all the mobs, and that's where there's going to be a system that focuses on the NPCs that implements all the AI. That hasn't been implemented yet. That's going to be, down the line. But right now we have the goblin, and the goblin here is mostly here so I can test things like the hit resolution, which is primarily what I'm working on first right now. Hold on, let me look at my notes. So the way that the hit resolution system works, it's actually separate from the physics system. The component does share the what I call the hitbox polygons. When the character is like moving around and hitting surfaces, one of its quote unquote boxes, it has the physics system. There's like several boxes that represents a single character, but the main one is the quote unquote hitbox, which is what allows it to kind of like move on the ground and like touch things, right? So that's also being shared with the hit resolution system, where as part of the hit resolution system, there is a target component, and then there's a hit component. Um, Fun fact: in the code base, I actually call all components managers. Really, they probably should be called components, but if I ever show like the code, which is likely going to happen in the future devlog, just know that if I use the word manager, it's really just a name for a component, right? So any entity that has a hit manager or hit component, right? The system goes and then looks specifically for those entities, right? Well, I guess more accurately, it filters out the entities based on those that have the hit component or the hit manager, and then it for each one of those hit managers, then it starts going and looking for entities that have the target manager, right? So as you can imagine, you know, every character should have a hit component and a target component. Not guaranteed. There might be a case where maybe I have an enemy that could hit you, right? But it can't it can't get struck, right? And a good example might be a environmental hazard, like a rock falling down from the ceiling could hit you, but you can't target it, right? Your strikes should pass through it, right? But it could still do damage to you. And I mean, long story short, all it does is just figures out like, hey, is the bounding box or those the hit polygons? Did they overlap with another enemy's like target, right? And then if they overlap, and then there's actually a mask you can't see. Not sure how to best explain this, but you can kind of visualize it here. Notice that like I'm swinging, and because the white flash of the sword isn't touching the goblin doesn't take damage. But if I do the second part of the slash, where the slash actually comes down onto the goblin, it does, take damage. Well, there's a kind of like an invisible sprite sheet that also it doesn't exactly play at the same time. What happens is it takes the index of each like image from like the animation sprite sheet and then uses that to determine what the appropriate like it's like sprite it should use for the mask, right? So basically, it does that, and then it just checks to see if there's any overlapping like pixels. But it only does that when the bounding boxes overlap between the hit component and then the target component, and then obviously if they match up, then it's oh okay, we'll an attack is uh is successful. Actually, that's not true. After it does that, it checks to see if the enemy is invincible. So currently, after it detects to see whether or not the hit like mask collides with the target mask, then it checks to see if is the target quote unquote in its invincible state, right? So when I hit it, it's kind of hard to see this, but if I hit it, I can't hit it again technically, right? When it's flashing, that's not really a sign of the enemy taking damage, actually. If you notice when I dash, I'm also flashing. That's part of my, uh, that's part of my, how do I say, I have an invincible system that's applied to every character. So there's certain conditions, for instance, like dashing or getting hit, where when those conditions occur, then a few ticks to their invincible system becomes like activated. So later on, the enemies aren't going to have the same invincible system as the player knight. Currently, just for testing, it does, right. But the idea is that when that system is activated, well, a successful hit can't happen. Um, so this is actually more important for the player, right? Where if they get hit, then nothing could actually do damage to them. There's actually going to be another invincible like system put in place later that the demo that's out there currently has in place. In fact, it has both the invincible and um, what I call the attack remembrance system. And again, I'm giving names to all these different systems, but when you play the game, they're just going to kind of work in the background. But they're it's really important. The idea of attack remembrance is that when you hit an enemy with a specific attack, for instance, like that slash is an attack, but the down slash is another attack, and the third slash is a separate attack. Those are all three separate distinct attacks that occur. Well, the enemy is going to become invincible for a specific attack, but it could still take damage from the next attack. And the reason for this is, well, if I hit the enemy once, I don't want the enemy to get hit again by the same attack. However, if the player character does another attack, then, well, they'll take damage from that. Right now, that's not in place, so technically speaking, the goblin's only taking damage when it's not flashing, right? So if I hit it twice, then those first two attacks didn't go through because the goblin was still in in its invincible state while that's happening. But with attack and remembrance, then each attack will go through, right? And that's kind of an advantage that the knight has over the enemies, since the knight's going to be facing more enemies, like multiple enemies at the same time. Um, so obviously the invincible system is stronger, right? So like if the knight gets hit by like five enemies, well, it only takes damage from one. It doesn't just get instant one shot, right? Let's see here. Yeah, so the invincible system also starts up on the dash, attack remembrance. This is not in yet, but later on there's gonna be a shield system. The shield system basically prevents the player also from taking damage, but it's a system that occurs that basically it's almost like a second like health pool, right? But it's a health pool that's like rechargeable during certain conditions. Obviously, health, which is going to be a number of hearts. It's the same system from the original demo. I'm going to basically use it again here. The shield system is going to work different in this game, though. The shield system is going to be basically you have like a shield that you keep, but it recharges after a while. It's going to be a power up, so like the knight's not going to get it right off the bat, but they can find a buff that grants it to them. Certain enemies are going to have shields, right? But just no, using normal attacks, you'll eventually be able to break it. But the thing about the shield is that it's rechargeable, right? So if you break it, but then you stop attacking the enemy, then the shield will eventually come back. There's still a few nuances that I need to kind of think through about how, like, how long it's going to come back. One idea that I'm kind of toying around in my head is that if you leave the enemy alone, the shield starts recharging faster, but if you hit it, it recharges slower, but will eventually come back at some point. And part of the reason for having the two different speeds is like for bosses, right? If you're, destroying the boss, right, you get through its shield. Uh, Eventually, I think the shield should come back, right? But you still want to keep hitting it to prevent the shield from coming back sooner. Um, let's see here. So there's also going to be this system's kind of already in place, but I just haven't implemented it fully. But when you hit an enemy, then the enemy will actually there's like a force applied when you hit an enemy. And the same thing is going to be true um, when like the enemy hits like the nine. Basically, if a character hits another character, they're gonna apply a force to it. And there's gonna be light attacks and heavy attacks. Where light attacks just hit the enemy, but like a heavy attack will actually cause the character to just kind of fly back with like fly back farther than normal. I'm like thinking that the final strike of the player's the knight's combo will apply a heavier attack, does more damage, and then it pushes the enemy back. But enemies can also do the same thing. All attacks either can do one heart damage or two. Is my current plan. Hmm. Okay, so I think that basically covers it for the hit resolution. So quite a bit of time was actually put into figuring out the render system, especially in terms of how I'm going to do the effects. Since I'm trying to be as optimal as possible, one thing that I was not really doing too well at all was batching my sprites well in the original demo, which, I mean, it still ran well. I mean, because it was running on a regular laptop computer. But since I'm trying to get at least the demo runnable on a web browser, one of my big concerns is like special effects and animations, which I think I basically need to make sure that I'm batching as much as possible. So like the regular animations are easy to get working with the sprite batch. Basically anything that has an animation, um, I do sprite dot begin obviously, and then I just draw all the current sprites from each animation. But the tricky part was the search and special effects. So I don't have many of the other special effects in. In fact, I only have one special effect in, which is just the flashing, which is obviously just using a shader to implement that effect. But the challenge of the effects is that you can only apply effect with each sprite batch. By the way, when I say sprite batch, I'm referring specifically that I'm something that I'm using with Monogame, which I believe originally came from XNA. With a sprite batch, you can basically prepare a whole bunch of images, right? And then that sprite batch object, using the graphics device, would, I guess, quote unquote, more efficiently load up the sprites to the render target. There's a bunch of like low level details that I'm not super familiar with, but from my basic understanding, you want to batch up as much as possible. The issue with that is that this flashing effect, if you try to have a separate sprite batch call that has your flashing effect, then that flashing effect will either appear behind everything or on top of everything, because both the knight and the goblin, they're sharing the same like sprite batch, right? They get submitted like together. So unfortunately, when it comes to this flashing effect, this needs to happen with each one of the characters. It can't happen within its own sprite batch. So I ended up doing a system where I'm rendering the like the flash to a separate buffers that are associated with each animation. And then when I'm using the sprite batch to print all the animations, one of the things that gets printed alongside of each animation is that buffer. So it's something that I'm going to try my best not to rely on, right? Like for some of the other special effects, I'm either going to have them get rendered always behind all the animations or always on top of the animations. That way I can use a single sprite batch to cover them. Um, but for cases when I need the shader to be with specifically the animation, then I have to do the whole rendering buffer thing. Um, let's see. So that was, I mean, that wasn't super bad. The most challenging thing was actually getting the game to render well on a browser. When I mean render well, I'm talking about the scaling and so how do I word this? So getting the game to run on a desktop app was pretty easy, but the challenge is a browser. So I'm not going to show this because this actually ends up screwing up the aspect resolution. I'll kind of show. So from your guys' perspective, the aspect ratios probably looks really bad. That's because of the tool that I'm using to do the recording off the browser, which is screen capture. I'm assuming what screen capture does is that it relies on the aspect ratio from when it starts. What I was doing just there was changing the size of the screen. If you play this game yourself on browser, which you should be able to once it gets posted up on itch.io, um, you can actually change the width, like the resize the screen, and the game itself actually conforms. It keeps the same aspect ratio, but it'll shrink and grow depending on the size of the screen, um, which is really nice. It's really convenient. The resolution kind of gets screwed up in places, so it's actually more recommended that you kind of keep the size the same, but it's something that it's nice to have. So being able to getting that to work ended up being quite challenging. Partly, and it was largely because of the fact that the viewport the viewport changes, like the viewport on the graphics device changes depending on the size of the screen, which did not play nicely with the tiled library that I was using and the camera. And basically, what would happen is because from my understanding, without changing any of the defaults, the um, the projection the projection matrix that was generated for tiled was changing with respect to the viewport, but the camera was not changing the same way, right? So what would happen is you would change the size of the screen, but then like all the animations would like float off. The tiled map, the graphics in the background, the walls, that comes from tiled. That doesn't use Sprite Batch to print. It actually has its own system for efficiently printing things to the screen, which is really convenient, right? It's supposed to be very optimal, and it saves me the trouble from having to like generate images for all the from all the maps. I could just use the tiled. I think it's like TMX. You could just use it directly, which is really nice. But after a lot of headache, I ended up making my own what's it called, viewport adapter, which is something that the camera needs. So I'm using Monogame Extended Camera. I'm probably going to talk about this in a future video. I did not prepare talking about this at all, but I ended up creating a new viewport adapter where I implemented a new viewport adapter such that um, it kept the scale, this like the scale that was just the identity, and the what's it called, the viewport. I think the viewport width and height. I set it equal. Basically, I implemented another viewport adapter such that it didn't like it didn't use the actual graphics device viewport at all. Keeping that the same made sure that whenever the game generated generated a frame, that frame itself was always the same size. So the resizing is actually happening outside of that. I basically, you know, generate basically rendering the game into its own render 2D like target, and then I resize that depending on the size, like the actual dimensions of the window, and that makes it far more consistent. A little bit concerned about performance there. I'm actually doing a lot of what's it called, rendering to separate targets, especially when it comes to these flashing effects. So I'm really hoping that I don't rely on this. But that was the simplest way I could figure out the simplest way I was able to implement being able to kind of change the screen size, while also maintaining the aspect ratio of everything. This was really a big problem for the browser, for the desktop app. Um, I mean, I'm using mostly the same code for everything, but I never had issues with the desktop app, presumably because the viewport dimensions was always consistent the same from the very beginning. So, all right, future work. So the next things that I plan to work on is attack remembrance. That's probably gonna be the next thing. Applying force to characters upon attacks. Um, Input buffer. So currently there's no like input buffer, right? And from my experience with Snake Extreme, certain people found the game felt kind of bad because when you try to like move the snake a direction, you might hit like a direction like sooner than expected, right? You're not timing it right. It feels kind of bad when you miss because it feels like the game isn't being responsive, and especially if people are just starting a game, I think that's really important. That the game feels responsive. So having like an input buffer system is definitely something that is needed. Oh, by the way, I mean currently I can't run through the goblin, but I'm gonna change it such that you can walk through every enemy. I think I just only did this for testing purposes. But yeah, so attack remembrance, applying force to characters, input buffers, and then starting to add more effects for the different states the character can be in. Right, I think it's gonna be very helpful slash borderline necessary for when like you're doing a wall jump, you have some type of indicator that your wall jump actually is ready. Um, and then also your dash too. So it's not noticeable. There's actually a timer on the dash where I can't just keep dashing, and you don't get the dash back immediately when you hit the ground. That timer basically only starts when you're on the ground. I'm sure you've noticed maybe in my prior devlog videos, there's been a few cases where I'm trying to run the level really quickly, right? But I'm right on the ground and then I dash, then I hit the ground again and I'm trying to dash right away, but the dash doesn't come out. Well, that's because that timer, that cooldown timer, didn't go off yet. So having more like indicators, I think is going to be key, which is something that I'm really gonna hone in on. Um, Once I get to the enemy AI, I'm thinking about having what I'm gonna call the emoticon system. I'll think of a better name. But the idea is that there's going to be like a question mark above the enemy's head if the enemy's suspicious of somebody being there, an exclamation mark to indicate that the enemy like sees you and is going to try and do something. Little tells like that, I think would make the game feel a lot better, having a lot more feedback for the player. Um, I think the last thing is improve the camera. Right now, I'm not really doing anything fancy with the camera. All that's happening is that I take the position of the knight and set it to the position of the camera. So there's no smoothing at all. It's just keeping the camera directly locked onto the player. I honestly feel like having the player just in the center. The boss fights is going to be different. I'm going to have the lock camera during the boss fight still, just like the original, well, in the demo version of the game or the original version of the game. I'm definitely going to keep that. But as you're playing through the game, I think just having the camera just dead on, maybe make the camera smoother just a little bit. But for the most part, I think it just feels a whole lot better to have the character in the middle. It's simple, real simple, but I don't think there's anything that can beat it. But damn, I must have been talking for at least 20 minutes. Hey, anybody who's made it this far into this video, Nice. I am happy that you're here listening. I don't expect anybody to get to this point. This was my besides the text that I use for just testing the sound and making sure the video is getting recorded properly. This was the one and one. This is the one and only take. I really don't feel like doing multiple takes. Um, but hey, if you got this far, or if you skipped to the end and got and able to hear this, hey, appreciate you taking the time to listen to this devlog video. Thank you and have a nice day.